Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 16th of January 2024. Sorry, my video was a little bit late earlier today. It just seemed to be taking an age to upload, and then when it doesn't go onto one channel and gets restricted, I then have to put it on another channel, and that's like an hour and a half gone since I recorded the video, so sorry about that. Right, just a few bits left over from the previous video that came out since. So in terms of strikes, the Russians have hit New York, which is a town between Bakhmut and Avdiivka in the Donetsk Oblast, hitting the settlement with 500-kilogram aviation bombs. These are the FAB 500, KAB 500 bombs that are doing so much damage across the front line. The Ukrainians are still suffering on the end of these bombs. The Russians are using them again with, well, not with impunity, but there's a widespread use of these. Did stop in the Krinky area, did stop in the southern Donetsk, Zaporizhia area after the Russians lost those Su-34 bombers and a few other planes, but then it seems to have started again and causing a real issue. Just another angle of the IL-22 plane that was hit just from the side now at the end of the plane. So, yeah, the Russian sources are reporting, as I mentioned, 11 or 12 pilots dying from the A-51. Normally, there are 15 people in those planes, so that's interesting that there were either fewer people there or they aren't reporting the full complement of pilots and airmen. There weren't reports of survivors in that incident. Additionally, the IL-22M signal for ambulances as well. Russians also constantly insist that the reason of the incident was not enemy fire. So just another image of that. Right, let's move on to aid now. And we'll start with the UN presenting strategic plans for UN humanitarian action in Ukraine in 2024 in the amount of $4.2 billion. Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, Irina Vereshchuk, expressed her gratitude to the UN and donor community for the assistance provided. Then we have Zelensky visiting Switzerland yesterday. Didn't return empty-handed. The Switzerland will allocate 1.6 billion euros from 2025 to 2028. So sort of, I guess, €500 million a year for reconstruction of Ukraine primarily. So that is good that Switzerland are on board in assisting in that manner. Head of German opposition has once again called for the supply of Taurus missiles to Ukraine, not for the first time, as mentioned once again. This is not uncommon, but hopefully they will be released at some point soon. Armor-piercing ammunition for FPV drones was developed in Ukraine, according to the Army of Drones. Combat part of the new EFPS ammunition has a shock core, a powerful anti-armor effect. We saw a T-90 tank, was it? No, it wasn't. It's T-80 BVM tank that was driving down a track, and it was hit by an FPV drone behind it, and the whole thing exploded catastrophically. I know I said, and then some other people said, the ammo rack's just underneath the turret and it can get in maybe there, but who knows? Because I was saying it did explode fairly big time with a mere drone munition. So could this be the use of an anti-armor munition on an FPV drone? That would make sense of the data. Now, the main part of the weapons produced by the Bulgarian military-industrial complex goes to Ukraine, according to head of Bulgarian Ministry of Defense. According to Tagarev, military aid to Kyiv includes old systems dating back to times in the USSR and ammunition. Bulgarian defense industrial complex is building a lot of constructing a lot of Soviet-era ammunition, as far as I understand. At the beginning of the war, Bulgaria were providing, some were claiming, a third of the ammunition that Ukraine was using. So Bulgaria have been superb in supporting Ukraine, have been incredibly important given the Soviet-era stuff that they manufacture. Russian Federation, on the other hand, has learned how to make the bodies for Shaheeds and has organized 2 production lines in the city of Yelabuga, where these drones are assembled from their own and imported components. This was stated by Vadim Skibitsky, a representative of the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine. Quote, the goal of Moscow is to reach a full, closed cycle of production of these drones in Russia by 2026. I'm not sure that they'll be able to replace or find a Russian analog, for example, the electronic base, chips, etc., he says. So that is a challenge for the Ukrainians going forward. In Finland, companies with Russian background keep exporting high valuable technology and components to Russia. So companies with Russian backgrounds operating in Finland have exported high technology and products needed by the war machine into Russia. The company's customers have connections to the Russian intelligence service and the defense industry, according to the a media organization there. So that needs to be stopped as soon as possible, for sure, obviously. Okay, going on to geopolitical information now. Here we have many eyes on Davos today, where Zelensky met with with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. They discussed the situation on the battlefield, Ukraine's defense needs, including strengthening air defense. The next NATO summit will be in Washington. On top of that, as mentioned, Zelensky met in Switzerland, where he met the chairman of the National Council of the Swiss Federal Assembly, chairman of the Council of Cantons, and the heads of parties and factions in the Swiss Federal Assembly. That's really important to try and appeal to those across the aisle who might not necessarily be on board with support of Ukraine. We had a meaningful conversation about topical issues, support for the Ukrainian peace formula, further steps towards its implementation, situation on the battlefield, the importance and the efforts of partner states to protect our country. Thank you to Switzerland's strong support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and for the humanitarian assistance to our country, said Zelensky. Canada is preparing to sign a security agreement with Ukraine. Ambassador of Canada to Ukraine, Natalka Kmok, has said, according to the diplomat, the office of the president has already received a draft of the relevant document. Now, this is something that was started with, I guess, the UK. They'd done this bilateral security agreement. And it was only yesterday that I realized how important this was. So whatever happens in Ukraine, at least this is my speculation, how I would understand what's going on with security guarantees. Because I'm thinking, security guarantees are the sort of things that NATO have in Article 5. But you can't do that now with the war as it stands. So what these arrangements and agreements must be, it's super important that if some kind of peace negotiation takes place now, so in worst case scenario, and we'll come on to this, worst case scenario is Ukraine has to give up a bunch of land to Russia. And then Russian regenerate their war capabilities. And then 10 years later, 5 years later, 15 years later, whatever it is, they go for another bite of the apple. If Ukraine are not in NATO by then, and there's no guarantee that will be the case, because they have to jump through a bunch of hoops, and you've got people like Turkey and people like Hungary going, not so sure. They need security guarantees bilaterally with nations. Now, if they had these individual security guarantees with UK, Canada, and a whole bunch of other nations, essentially NATO, but unilaterally, and those agreements are, as far as I understand it, that Ukraine would come to the UK's help in the UK's case, and Canada's case, Ukraine would come to help them if they were invaded. But likewise, UK and Canada would come to the Ukraine's assistance if they were invaded. Now, if this war stops and there's a peace agreement, even if it's not to the benefit of Ukraine, if Russia is still going to want to continue inching away at Ukraine, taking territory further down the line from them, then actually, this is an analog to NATO Article 5, and the UK and Canada and other nations, they're going to be doing this kind of security agreement with other nations, will then come to the aid of Ukraine. So although it's not a NATO Article 5, it's an analog of that individually with nations, and that would surely mean that Russia would not do that. This could be some very sensible politicking going on here from Ukraine. I hadn't really understood how important that was. And I still haven't seen the text of these agreements, but I'm fairly sure it is pretty important. In fact, somebody sent me an understanding of the agreement. Let's have a look. Having just said all of that, this is thanks to Chris Jones who sent this to me. This is inside the UK-Ukraine Agreement on Security Cooperation, Defence, Maritime Security, Combating Information Influence. Although there's a lot of good things here, stuff to do with cybersecurity, but also Russian information influence. That's really important to me. The UK and Ukraine working together to combat that, and indeed serious crime as well. But I can't actually see security guarantees in terms of how we understand the term. So this is agreement on security cooperation rather than a security guarantee. So a security agreement. So I don't know if what I'm saying there is true. However, that would be really interesting because we have heard the term security guarantee, bilateral security guarantees be mentioned. So if that is a case, then refer to what I just said. I just don't know whether what the UK has provided is a security guarantee. But I'm sure they did talk about that, because they were talking about how Ukraine would come to the UK's assistance if that was the case. So I'm sure there must be some element of security guarantee going on there. Anyway, moving on. For what it's worth, China's state-owned banks are tightening restrictions on financing Russian clients after the US approved secondary sanctions against foreign banks that aid Russia in its invasion of Ukraine. I think this is really good news. And if China or Chinese entities are closing the loopholes that allow Russia to get around these sanctions, then that can only be good news for Ukraine. Right, moving on. No report says, quote, discussions are ongoing in the US Congress on the adoption of new aid package for Ukraine, and there is already a lot of progress, says Ambassador of Ukraine to the United States, Oksana Markarova, on the sidelines of the Peace Formula meeting in Davos. Okay, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you here. I am not hopeful that the US are going to provide aid to Ukraine. Certainly not for some time. I don't know. Maybe I'm being pessimistic. I'm quite depressed about this, actually. The US aid to Ukraine, $61 billion worth of military aid, and the sheer size of the US stockpiles and the size of the US armed forces mean that they are in a unique position to help Ukraine. They really are in a unique position. So as much as Europe needs to pick up the slack, and they're working hard, the European nations and allies, and you're looking at how much assistance they're giving as a percentage of GDP, per capita, all these other metrics, things are looking good for Europe, but they realistically aren't going to be able to match what the US does. I mean, population-wise, the whole of Europe is a little bit bigger, 100 million bigger than the population of the US, but that includes nations that are very poor, like Romania and some of the Balkan nations and so on and so forth. The US is one of the richest countries, or the richest country in the world, and has a massive military industrial complex and a defense budget that dwarfs all other nations combined for the next however many nations, right? It is phenomenal what the US are capable of doing. And so when there's a hold up to $61 billion worth of aid, that's really meaningful. The US aid is huge. There's nothing will get around the fact that the Ukraine need the US. They absolutely need the US on side, and they need them consistently on side. We're now getting to, I don't know, is it 4 months worth of no massive meaningful aid to Ukraine? Yes, it's been the Presidential Drawdown Authority aid, but even that's come to an end, right? And it just doesn't look good. The impasse in Congress is not good. And when you look at what the rhetoric coming out of some of these MAGA Republicans are, that is spreading along the base, then things get more depressing. When you hear what some of the people are actually saying, even people like Marjorie Taylor Greene yesterday, about how they view Ukraine aid, this is now a partisan issue. And I can't believe something as important as this globally has become a US domestic partisan issue. And that, for me, sounds a death knell for continued reliable assistance to Ukraine. And, as much as I am communicating stuff to you that, and I'll show you that things are going well for Ukraine here, and there are elements of how things are going really well, Russia has a much bigger population than Ukraine, and it has more boots on the ground, and it has more ability to put boots on the ground, and Putin is a dictator. And that puts Russia in a very much more comfortable position going forward than Ukraine. Ukraine has done an amazing job, but they only have so much. They have endless resilience, but they don't have endless resources and endless numbers of people in the same way that Russia do to some degree. And things are tough on the front line, right? Things are tough in Krinky. There are losses that are being felt keenly by the Ukrainians. In certain areas, things like in the Krinky area, I'm hearing that the Russians are now getting wired communications in place, which means that Ukrainians can't can no longer intercept Russian communications. Things like this, where the Russians are able to use the time to adapt. They are being attrited at monumental rates, but they don't particularly care about that. And all the time that's happening, they're attriting the Ukrainians away and being able to put fortifications in place and build tangible, wired communication lines. Just stuff like that, and the drones that are flying over into Ukraine, mapping out Ukraine, and the longer this goes on, there is a sense that it can play more into Russians' hands, both politically and militarily, and that is a real concern. And then when you start looking at the situation of the U.S. politics, okay, so Phillips O'Brien says a reminder that 80% of the Republican Party, just voted for candidates in the Iowa caucus who are hostile to aiding Ukraine. Now, Iowa's there's a particular political landscape in Iowa. It's a very Republican area. You are going to get this kind of makeup here, but this is a challenge for Ukrainian aid. And I know I'm going to annoy many of my American viewers here, but we have to talk about this. This is the reality of what's going on politically speaking in the US. So you might want to start getting ready for this. So Trump gets 51% of the vote, DeSantis gets 22% of the vote, Nikki Haley 19%, and everyone else is out. Ramaswamy's just dropped out. Okay. So in fact, let's just make sure that we know what's going on there. So Vivek Ramaswamy has dropped out the presidential race. I quote, "I have no chance of being the next president," Ramaswamy told supporters in Des Moines after partial Iowa caucus results showing him in fourth place with only 7.7% of the vote. But this isn't about, none of these people, in my opinion, for any of these people, it's not about becoming president. It's about what goes on in 2028, well, at least for Nikki Haley and Ramaswamy more, or can Ramaswamy run as VP, vice president for Trump, or so on and so forth. He's dropped out and he's endorsed Trump. Okay. What's interesting is DeSantis, I think, is done. So he's put all his eggs in this basket, and he was expecting much more than this. And earlier on in the campaign, he would have predicted much more than this. And actually, to only get less than 22% is not good, because he's basically, from what I understand, and I'm sure you'll correct me, Americans out there, but he's kind of left Florida behind a bit. He's up sticks and basically moved to Iowa to kind of do all this stuff. And meanwhile, Florida is suffering as a result. So loads of policies have been enacted in Florida that aren't universally popular, and then it's been embroiled in controversy. So the Republican chair of the Republican Party in Florida has just been ousted. Him and his wife sits on the school board for Florida, and she has been enacting anti-LGBT policies educationally in Florida, while she's been involved in a threesome with another woman with the Republican chair. He's then been accused of rape by that person who they've been previously involved with, and then voyeurism, video recording, and all sorts of stuff. He's been ousted as the chair there. She's like holding on to this school board position, presenting anti-LGBT stuff whilst being involved in a threesome with another woman. You couldn't write this stuff. Anyway, all that kind of stuff's going on in Florida. Then makes me wonder, does that mean Florida might go against DeSantis? Is this a kind of like, does this become a purple state? Anyway, whatever. The point being that I think DeSantis is done there. Politically speaking, I don't think 2028 will offer him any chance of getting presidency. I think he's burnt his bridges, and it's just so lots of interesting stuff. So Nikki Haley could move forward, especially in New Hampshire, where you get independent voters allowed to vote in these Republican primaries. You will have Nikki Haley probably coming a much better second place to Trump there. Some people saying even ahead of Trump. But nonetheless, even though half of the people didn't vote for Trump, actually Ramaswamy supporters will be Trump supporters. A lot of DeSantis supporters will go to Trump as their second choice. Now, why am I spending a lot of time talking about this? Well, actually, sorry, that's not supposed to be there. If Trump gets in and there are all these legal issues, that need to be sorted out. A lot of people are suggesting that really he is in a lot of legal trouble, but is that constitutionally a problem for actually running for president? Was it the 1930s or someone way back when actually got 1 million votes from prison to run for president? So the Constitution says nothing about that. But is he going to be invalidated in other ways? Those legal woes are hard. But let's listen to what Trump says himself about Ukraine. This is important.
But the question here is, would you give
so you can't hear that very well. I've just got a plug-in that means I should be able to turn that up. Hopefully you'll hear this being turned up.
Ukraine weapons and funding if you were
elected? I would sit down. Let me just put it a nicer way. If I'm president, I will have that war settled in 1 day, 24 hours.
How would you settle that war in 1 day?
Because I'll meet with Putin, I'll meet with Zelensky. They both have weaknesses and they both have strengths. And within 24 hours, that war will be settled. It'll be over. It'll be absolutely over.
Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I don't think in terms of winning and losing. I think in terms of getting it settled so we stop killing all these people and breaking down this country. Now,
so this was a town hall previously at CNN. Sorry about the volume stuff. Turns out I didn't have my headphones turned up very much. Oops. The amount of applause he's getting, albeit from a fairly partisan audience, kind of worries me, because what he says is mere assertion. Right? This is just, I can give you the moon on the stick. Yay! Moons on sticks. Yay! It's like, I could get this sorted in a day. Yay! People believe this.
You said you don't think in terms of winning and losing. Mr. President, can I just follow up on that, because that's a really important statement that you just made there. Can you say if you want Ukraine or Russia to win this war?
So important.
I want everybody to stop dying.
He does not say he wants Ukraine to win the war.
They're dying, Russians and Ukrainians. I want them to stop dying. And I'll have that done. I'll have that done in 24 hours. I'll have it done. You need the power of the presidency to do it.
But you won't say that you want Ukraine to win. You
know what I'll say? I'll say this. I want Europe to put up more money.
So this is classic shiny things, bait and switch, or he wasn't really baiting, but this is kind of red herring stuff. I will not answer that. I'll evade answering that question. You want me to say I want Ukraine to win? Any other person would say they want Ukraine to win, surely. In this kind of situation from an allied nation, but he doesn't say it. And he then goes on to talk about what is now incorrect figures about the idea that Europe is not paying anything and America pays everything. And he doesn't answer the question about Ukraine.
Because they're in for 20 billion, we're in for 170, and they should equalize. They have plenty of money.
That's also wrong. Those figures are wrong.
With NATO,
but
when I sat down, I got them to put up hundreds of billions of dollars that they weren't paying under Obama and Bush and all of these other presidents. That's why they're able to help them fight the war, because of the money I got. But I want Europe.
What's happening in Ukraine,
I want Europe to put up more money, because they're laughing at us. They think we're.
And this is so classic. This is like, I will dictate what we're going to talk about, and I will not answer the question. And this frustrates the hell out of me for people like this. I mean, I would just be not going on until this man answered my exact question. And I would literally, I'm not moving on. Who do you want to win? Ukraine or Russia? Who do you want to win? Ukraine or Russia?
We're a bunch of jerks. We're spending $170 billion for faraway land, and they're right next door to that land, and they're in for 20.
No.
I don't think so.
When it comes to what's happening there, when you were in office, you said that you respected.
So, and she goes on to talk about how he respected Putin and said he respects Putin. He goes on to talk about that. But I wouldn't have gone on from that question. Now, you need to understand, why am I belaboring this point? If this guy is going to be president, you need to understand what he believes.
Easier of it, but I can get it done, and I can get it done quickly.
Some people hear you say you're going to end the war in 24 hours, and they worry that means President Putin is going to get to keep the territory he's unlawfully
I'd make a fair
claimed.
deal for everybody. Nope.
Doesn't mean that? Wouldn't be a win for Putin?
That's something that could have been negotiated, because there were certain parts, Crimea and other parts of the country, that a lot of people expected could happen. You could have made a deal. So they could.
He is advocating, and I said this before when this interview came out, he's advocating that Crimea, even before the war started, give them Crimea. So straight away, he is Russian appeasement. Straight away, he is parroting the Kremlin talking points. like the Kremlin desires and objectives.
Could have made a deal where there's less territory right now than Russia's already taken, to be honest. And you could have made a deal where nobody was killed. They had a deal. They would have had a Ukraine country. Now nobody even knows if Ukraine is going to be totally taken over. I will say this. Something's going on, and it's not good for Ukraine.
I want to ask you about something President Putin said about you this week. I don't know if you've seen it.
So again, you've got the situation where Putin says he likes Trump and wants Trump to be the president. That tells you something. You've got Trump saying that Ukraine would have to negotiate their land away and that he would sort it out in 24 hours. And you've got Zelensky that then came out and said, okay, what's your deal? You tell us what how you would sort this out in 24 hours. And it appears to be just giving Putin what he wants. And then at the same time, Zelensky invited, when this kind of all came out, he invited Trump to Ukraine. He didn't go to Ukraine. Okay, he refused. And then we have Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, being held at gunpoint by Marjorie Taylor Greene, who says, not over my dead body will this money go to Ukraine, effectively. And I'll be leveraging, that with Mike Johnson and with other Republican lawmakers. And then Mike Johnson then saying, I'm going to visit Taiwan, but I'm not going to visit Ukraine. So I am worried, right? I'm genuinely worried about aid to Ukraine. And therefore, that translates into being worried about the outcome for this war. Like, Russia can't win, but this will present a situation where Ukraine still loses. So it's like this sort of forced negotiated settlement. It's really worrying. On the other hand, in the UK, luckily we have bipartisan support. Labour leader Keir Starmer, I'm just going to play you what he said yesterday, confirmed support for Ukraine as long as it takes. Labour is far ahead of Rishi Sunak's Tories, which is heading for a general election wipeout. Recent polls show that the Tories will retain just 169 seats and Labour will sweep to power with 385. So that's based on different on polling, but it is.
As does, Mr. Speaker, the UK's unwavering unity in support of Ukraine and against Russian aggression. On these benches, we have backed all military support. So again, we back the Prime Minister's announcement of £2.5 billion for Ukraine next year. And we strongly support the agreement on security cooperation. This will give Ukraine vital confidence to plan for the year ahead.
Just honestly, there's a real stark difference here. We strongly agree. This is bipartisan. Labour hate the Tories, right? But they understand that this is more important than partisan, throwing of tomatoes at each other in the stocks.
I hope it becomes a template for other allies to follow, and that Ukraine, in time, will become a full member of NATO.
And I'm sorry, at the same time, you've got, albeit possibly fringe members of the Republican Party, but certainly like a very vocal minority that is growing, saying we don't want Ukraine in NATO.
As Mr. Speaker, to those listening in Kyiv, Moscow, or elsewhere in the world, let me be clear. Whoever is in government in Britain, the UK will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes.
So that's really, that's really good news. So at least there is that. But, without that aid from the US and with what might happen in the elections, where does that leave everyone else? And where does that leave Ukraine? Speaker of the Parliament of Latvia, Daiga Marina, has arrived in Kiev, reports the official Facebook page of the Verkhovna Rada. This visit will further strengthen the friendly alliance between our countries and Parliament. So there is this very strong alliance between the Baltic states and Ukraine. The Romanian government has reached an agreement with the farmers. Is it on? Is it off? Is it on? Is it off? These kind of border issues, both in Poland and and recently in Romania. So they've come to an agreement with the farmers who have blocked the border with Ukraine. The agricultural minister has said that the agreement covers 13 farmers' demands, but discussions will continue to find a compromise on other demands. The government has committed to fully subsidise all agricultural excise duties by 2026 and to immediately implement provisions on subsidised interest loans. So making some really big commitments there. No reports reporting from Poland here, I think, or about Poland. I think that we should think and talk about is Ukrainian-Polish alliance within the EU, because we will be two very strong players. We will make Poland stronger and Poland will make us stronger, says the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Dmytro Kuleba. He's talking about very strong unity within the EU, trying to cozy up with certain nations. Poland, and particularly Donald Tusk's Poland, as he sees, or Ukraine see that as a good relationship to foster with regard to helping them to accede to the EU. Now, the worry is that Ursula von der Leyen, her re-election may be in doubt due to growing popularity of right-wing parties, and that's according to Politico. And again, this is something else that really worries me going forward. The political landscape in the world, I think, is really challenging, especially for me as a liberal globalist. I think there's a lot of desire for people to become isolationist and talk about kind of little England or little whatever country it is. You know, this idea of not working together, of not, broadening our cooperative reach. I think it's just a massive challenge. And I actually don't mind Ursula von der Leyen. I think she's doing a fairly decent job in charge of the EU. In 2019, the candidacy of the current head of the European Commission was supported by a coalition of socialists, liberals and conservatives. They secured a slim majority of 383 votes out of the necessary 374. With the far right, so, this is where conservatives and liberals are working together. But it's this growing group of far right representatives from across Europe, which is really worrying. With the far right gaining ground across Europe, von der Leyen could face difficulties in trying to regain victory. And this is amplified, or the divisions are made greater by the activities of Russia. You've got the information war being waged right across the world, and in the EU or in Europe, including in UK, you have Russian disinformation projects trying to drive wedges into these widening gaps in divisions within nations, and they are particularly amplifying the rhetoric of the far right in many countries, and sometimes the far left, but more often the far right at the moment, to try and break up the EU. And I think they're doing a fairly good job of that. And all the while, we've got other fires burning in the world. So the situation in the Korean Peninsula is more dangerous than it has been at any time since early June 1950. That may sound overly dramatic, but we believe that, like his grandfather in 1950, Kim Jong-un, has made a strategic decision to go to war. This is an alarming analysis from people who are not normally this alarmist, generally not alarmist. So it is notable that the two analysts in question were something like doves, consistently arguing for many years that a diplomatic accommodation with the North was possible, and earnestly sought goal of the Kim regime. The argument is that the failure to achieve this under Trump, when it was offered only to be denied, has led to a strategic recalculation on Kim's part. I lack familiarity with the North Korean sloganeering to evaluate these claims. However, contra some military analysts asking for hard evidence, I do believe that as a Leninist regime that uses sloganeering as a central coordinating mechanism, the North Korean regime could not be understood any other way. This is a real issue. You've got North Korea, South Korea boiling. Then you've got what's going on in the Red Sea area. It appears that a US-owned Marshall IS flagged bulker, Gibraltar Eagle, MV, I think, of Eagle Bulk, that's the company, was hit yesterday. Ship was sailing from Pohang, South Korea to Suez when struck by a missile. This is part of the swing in attacks by the Houthis from the southern Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden. This is really challenging. Underwriters are now charging between 0.75% and 1% of the value of the ship to sail through the region, jumping significantly since US and UK airstrikes and other nations in on that targeted Houthi rebels in Yemen. So this is Red Sea insurance soaring, and I said that that's what would happen, and then you're going to get that knocked onto consumers. You are going to have inflation. You might even get another energy crisis popping up, and this will then detract from what is going on in Ukraine. And all the while, North Korean foreign ministers meeting in Moscow, and they're saying, North Korea is our closest neighbor and partner with whom we are developing and intend to further develop partnerships in all areas, according to Dmitry Peskov. So you've got this axis of evil getting together, being all matey, all the while stuff is going down around the world, and there's possibly a breakup of unity in, say, the EU, in partnerships between the US and other nations, because the US is at this impasse, and this is not the time. This is just not the time to be having an impasse. This is just not the time for there to be a division being stoked around the world. But of course, the opportunism of Russia is plain to see, and they're obviously going to take advantage of all the chaos that is taking place. I think this is really worrying. I am in a worried state today, personally, psychologically. I am frustrated about the US. I have to be honest with you. I'm frustrated at US politics and with the continued rise of some of the political voices over there. It is a challenge, I think, for someone like me, and for someone who really strongly supports Ukraine and think it's the most important thing in the world going on at the moment. On that note, I do have an announcement. I'll probably do a live quite shortly. I have an announcement I think that you might be interested in. It's pretty important. Anyway. Enough from me. Thanks for watching. It is a bit of a kind of political ramble today, and I will undoubtedly have annoyed many of my American viewers. But I think it's this important. We do have to talk about it. I'm not going to not talk about American politics. It will please some people. It will annoy others. Depends where you sit on the spectrum, of course. I'll be saying some things that many of you will be nodding your head about, and I'll be saying other things that many of you will be shouting at the screen over and throwing things at my face, virtually speaking. Anyway, take care. Speak soon.